Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our class on free will and determinism. This is an exciting topic for me. In fact, this is the topic of my senior thesis when I was in college. It's a topic I've cared about for a long time, and I continually find interesting. I also find it a little bit frustrating because I feel like the standard way of having the discussion between free will and determinism, or about free will and determinism, sometimes fails to capture, for me, the essence of what we want out of free will. And this is going to be related to our last class session on mental causation and philosophy of mind. So let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing I want to talk about is determinism. Determinism is basically the view that all of our actions are predetermined. And this could mean a couple of different things. This doesn't necessarily mean a type of fatalism. It doesn't necessarily mean fate or destiny or God's plan or anything super lofty and fatalistic like that. It could mean that. For some people, it really does. If you're religious, for example, you might think that there's an overall plan to the universe and that our actions are somehow tied into that plan in a way that's outside of our control. That's not usually the kind of thing that philosophers mean when they talk about determinism. They mean something a little less grandiose than that. Generally, what philosophers mean by determinism is just the idea that for any given action we have or any given state of affairs, that action or state of affairs is caused by some prior physical state of affairs, determined by what came before. We looked at this last time when we were talking about physical brain states, one brain state being the physical cause of a brain state at a subsequent instance. It could be like billiard balls knocking around on a table, one billiard ball knocking into the other. But the idea is that current state of affairs are determined by prior state of affairs. And of course, if that's the case, if any given current state of affairs, any event, any decision, any action is just determined, necessitated by a prior state of affairs, you run the risk of eliminating the role of free will in our actions. There doesn't seem to be any room for agency, any room for us to change the course of events if the current state of events is determined by previous state of events. So that's all very broad and very general. But I think you get the core of the idea. The idea is that if we want to hold on to some notion of free will, we need to be responsible for our own actions. We need to be able to change the course of events in some way. So let's dive in and talk about some of these different theories. I put together a really short outline of different types of determinism, and this is not exhaustive. There are others, but I think these are the main kinds of deterministic factors that you could point to. And we'll talk about these in detail here in a minute, but I actually put together something of a visual presentation of these. So from the reading, you probably got this notion of Laplace's demon. Laplace was a philosopher who basically had this idea that if you knew the position and the momentum of every piece of matter in the universe, think about this. Now, this is massively complicated. That's why it's called a demon. It would be some super intelligent creature, analogous to Descartes' evil genius. But imagine a super intelligent creature who is intelligent enough to know the position and the momentum of every piece of matter in the universe. The idea is that if that were the case, you should, in theory, be able to predict the future indefinitely, because the future, in some sense, is determined by the past. The current and future states of matter and the positions and momentums of all the pieces of matter in the cosmos are determined by their prior states, all the way back to the beginning of the universe until the end of time. So that's called Laplace's demon. This idea that if you knew the exact positions and the exact movements of all the matter in the universe, you should, in theory, be able to predict the future. Now, in practice, we can't do that. It's too complicated. No computer on the planet, probably not even any future supercomputer, could take into account the position and the momentum of every piece of matter in the universe, modeling the universe one to one. But I think you get the idea. The idea is that as matter interacts with pieces of matter interact with each other in the universe, it's deterministic, kind of like the image of Newton's cradle that I put on the screen here. There's something incredibly deterministic and mathematical about the way in which this type of interaction happens, the kinds of interactions that Newton told us about in classical physics. That's the worry, that if the universe operates like that, completely mathematically and deterministically and precisely, to the point where you could, in principle, calculate the future states of the universe based on the current or past states of the universe, it doesn't seem like there's any room for free will. It seems like all of our actions, since our body being physical in nature, part of the universe, would be determined by all of those factors as much as anything else in the universe. So it seems like it squeezes out the room for free will. It's an interesting thought experiment. Of course, if you know anything at all about contemporary physics, you might be concerned that the universe doesn't actually work that way at a fundamental level, in a way that we'll talk about here in a minute. But in classical physics, Newtonian physics, this is the vision of causation in the universe, kind of billiard balls knocking into each other, pieces of matter kind of knocking around and interacting in mathematical, deterministic, predictable ways, such that if you could take all of the factors into account, you should be able to predict the future. So that's called LaPlace's demon, but it stems from this Newtonian view of Newtonian physics that interactions of matter are all deterministic and mathematical. Last time, if you remember, we talked about this concept of physical causal closure, which is the idea that for any two physical events, let's call them P1 and P2. Of course, last time in philosophy of mind, we were talking about brain states, P1 being a physical brain state at a certain point in time, and P2 being a physical brain state at a later point in time. The idea is that if P2 is determined by P1, in other words, if P1 is a sufficient cause for P2, then it doesn't look like there's any need to invoke a mental cause at all for why P2 occurs. P2 being a brain state or even some physical action of our body that seemingly arises from a decision, seemingly arises from a mental cause. It looks like the fact that you can always point to a sufficient physical cause seems to squeeze out the need or exclude the need for any to invoke any mental causes to explain physical events. But again, I think the effect of this in terms of free will and determinism is that it seems to preclude the possibility of free will. If mental properties can play no causal role whatsoever in determining physical events, then in what sense is there free will? It would have to be a very weak sense of free will. So, and for me, this is actually the heart of the free will determinism discussion. And it's actually a shame, I think, that these two concepts aren't related together more when philosophers talk about free will and determinism. I think in the 20th century, the dominant view was a view called compatibilism that we're going to look at towards the end of class today. The view that free will and determinism don't actually contradict with each other. That was an incredibly popular view in the 20th century. But to me, that view never really captured the heart of what we want out of free will. You know, if I decide to do something, if I decide to major in philosophy versus major in biology, if I decide I want a tuna sandwich for lunch instead of a chicken sandwich for lunch, if I decide to, go have coffee at Panera versus going to Starbucks, the heart for me of free will is that was a decision that came from me. It was, in some sense, my decision, my mental properties, my mental state caused those events to happen, caused me to go one direction or the other direction. So unless we're talking about the causal role that mental properties or mental states or mental events play in bringing about physical states of events, namely what my body actually does, I don't feel like it's a very robust sense of free will. So for me, the question of free will really does boil down to the question of mental causation. But unfortunately, those two concepts, mental causation and free will, are not commonly linked in the discussion of free will and determinism. And I think that's a huge mistake in the way that the discussion of free will and determinism commonly goes in the history of philosophy. But you can see the relation, I think. If there's no mental causation, if our mind plays no causal role in bringing about physical events, then in what sense do we have free will? Another reason to hold determinism. There are lots of other kinds of determinism. I think if you're a biologist or a sociologist or a psychologist, you are going to have lots of other reasons for thinking that our actions and our decisions are not under our control, that they're influenced by factors outside of our control. A very simplistic way of thinking about this is in terms of biological determinism. Think of the way that these ducklings that you see on the screen follow the mother duck or get imprinted on another creature. It doesn't even have to be their actual mother. They can get imprinted on a human for that matter. But there's an instinct there. There's a drive towards a certain kind of behavior that is in some sense outside of those ducklings' control. It's innate. It's built into them, hardwired into the way their brains operate to exhibit certain behaviors. And then, of course, the natural question arises, well, what does that mean for humans? Which of our behaviors and which of our reactions are instinctive, hardwired into us, and which are a matter of nurture, which are a matter of training or conditioning, which are ultimately under our own control, and which factors of our behavior are being influenced by the things that are innate and built into us. Like, for example, very early in a baby's upbringing, a baby will have a spatial awareness of like, say, a boundary of a table. If you put a baby on a table, eventually the baby will sort of perceive the edge of the table at a very, very young age. And that's amazing, right? Because there's no context. A baby that's just born has no spatial context for understanding the world. And yet those behaviors are exhibited so early. And again, it's not something that's conscious, not something that the baby decides. It's instinctive. So a lot of our behaviors are arguably like the ducklings following the mother duck. And you can talk about countless other examples of biological determinism, which you've probably read about or thought about in prior biology classes, either in college or in high school. You get the concept, I think. The concept is just that our behaviors are hardwired into us in some sense. But it's not obvious at all which of our behaviors are instinctive and which of our behaviors are freely chosen. But you can see the principle here. Biological determinism, or instinct, seems to undercut the notion that our behaviors are under our own control, that they're genuinely freely chosen. In other words, the free will that you might think, like if you could say, well, these ducklings are choosing to follow the mother. Well, in some very, very weak sense of free will, right? It's not so much a free decision as an instinctive urge that's outside that being's control. It doesn't make sense to talk about the duckling choosing to follow the mother, right? There's a reason we have this language of instinct and behavior being hardwired. So that's biological determinism. That's yet another reason for thinking not all of our decisions are under our control. Not all of our actions are freely chosen. There's lots of other kinds of determinism, though. One that comes to mind is psychological determinism, or what we know as conditioning. People's responses are largely conditioned based on stimulus and response, right? As people get positive stimuli or negative stimuli, over a long time period, over the course of their entire lives, over repeated instances of whatever those stimuli are, people's behavior and their reactions get conditioned to various kinds of stimuli. Shock therapy would be a typical example, right? If you come to expect a shock based on certain kinds of behaviors, you're going to train yourself out of those behaviors. And if you get rewarded for certain things, like the rat here searching after the cheese on this, corny image I put on the screen, if you get a reward for certain kinds of behavior, then you're going to develop that behavior, and that behavior will become instinctive. You'll be conditioned for certain kinds of behaviors. You can train people out of behaviors that way. You can form new instincts and new conditioned behaviors in people through positive reinforcement. So that notion of negative and positive reinforcement, of conditioning people's responses, again, is a reason for thinking that maybe our reactions and our actions in general are not as freely chosen as we would like to think. Maybe our actions and our reactions are more like psychological conditioning, more like the rat getting rewarded with cheese at the end of the maze, and of avoiding pain, avoiding the shocks and the negative reinforcement of life, and less like freely chosen actions, freely chosen responses. I don't know about you guys, but I the more and more I think about my own life, I can see ways in my own life in which my reactions are largely conditioned based on past experiences. That means something to me. It probably means something totally different for you based on your own unique experiences. But I think you get the idea that if you ever have the sense that you're reacting and your reactions are not completely in your own control, that's what I have in mind here. The way in which your actions or reactions, things that could look like they're freely chosen, but probably are a result of psychological conditioning, really are conditioned based on your past experiences, both positive and negative. But again, this is another reason for thinking maybe we don't have as much free will as we'd like to think we have. If a lot of our actions are conditioned, what room is there for free will? Another category is what I would call social or cultural determinism. Just the idea that the way you function in a certain society is largely outside of your control. All of the implicit social rules that govern the way we operate as Americans, or here in Idaho, or in a certain cultural or social group. The kinds of things that Wittgenstein was talking about when he was talking about language games. The implicit rules and structures that govern what's allowed to be said and what actions count as a good move inside of the game, inside a particular context, either verbally or in terms of actions and practices. All of that is a type of determinism, right? If your actions and your reactions, the things you say, the things you do, are constrained and governed by your upbringing, by the culture that you live in, by the religious view you have, by your social groups, by your country, there's so many ways you could go with this, right? But if your actions are constrained and guided by those factors, again, that's a reason for thinking that any of the actions you have, any of the things you say, any of the practices you have, any of the things you do may not be as freely chosen as you think they are. Even if you have this subjective sense of making a decision, like, oh, what I'm going to decide what to major in college, but you're getting family pressure and peer pressure and cultural pressure and pressure from your friends and pressure from the school counselor and pressure from your instructors and all of these factors that go into your decision about what you're going to major in for college. This is just an example, of course, right? All of that is a constraining factor. If you might think you're taking into account all of these factors and making a free decision, but you could just as plausibly say that your decisions are being guided and steered and shaped and determined by all those factors, and that decision is not really a freely chosen decision in any robust sense. So I lumped all of this together and just called it social or cultural determinism. I think you get the idea that our actions may be constrained or determined by social and cultural factors, the vast majority of which are outside of our control because we don't get to choose the society we live in generally. Most of those factors are handed to us either in historically in the history of the world or the history of our country or society, in the history of your family, in the history of your religion, and of course the day-to-day factors that are outside your control. So cultural and social determinism. So given all of those things, given physical laws of nature, which seem to govern physical behaviors in the physical world, our bodies included. I mean, even the way our bodies function is very mechanistic, right? The way doctors treat our body is generally reductionistic. All the pieces function together in a very orderly, precise kind of way. It can get out of whack, and that's why you have to go to the doctor sometimes. But generally, our bodies function kind of like a machine. It has a deterministic quality in the way our bodies function. Physical causal closure, the idea that maybe there's no room for mental causation at all, that causation that is sufficient on a physical level seems to preclude the possibility that there's any mental causation. So again, maybe so much for free will. Biological determinism and instinct, factors that are hardwired into us that determine our behaviors. Psychological conditioning, most of which is outside of our control, positive and negative stimuli, conditioning us into certain responses or out of certain responses, again, generally outside of our control, and all of these social and cultural factors that are, again, outside of our control. So for me, the starting point for the discussion of free will and determinism is, given all these factors, given physical laws of nature, given biological instincts, given psychological conditioning, given social and cultural determinism, and all of these social and cultural factors that are outside of our control, what room is there left for free will? And for me, that's the fundamental question. In fact, let me jump ahead to the last slide here. This was the question of free will for me. Given all those factors, what room could there possibly be for free will? And what I want to do now, I want to look at a few different options for trying to preserve this notion of free will. And again, you might wonder why we care so much, right? Why, if it turns out that our actions aren't freely chosen and they're completely determined either by physics and physical laws of nature, by our biology, by our anatomy, by the way our brains function, or neuropsychologically, whether our actions are determined psychologically, through conditioning, whether our actions are determined socially. Who cares? Like, why is this such a big issue? We've talked about this a little bit in previous class sessions, but I think we have good reason for holding on to the notion of free will if we can, right? We do, in fact, hold people morally responsible for things. Our entire legal system seems to depend on the notion that humans are in control of their own actions, at least sometimes, right? And if they're not, someone who, let's use a simple example like murder. Someone who makes a conscious, premeditated decision to murder someone else, we hold them very responsible. We call that first degree murder, right? But we do have these concepts of a lower degree of murder. If you accidentally murdered someone, if it was a crime of passion, for example, and you were not in control of your actions for one reason or another, we might call that manslaughter or some lower degree of murder, right? So we do make these legal gradations, but we do have these highly accountable concepts like first degree murder, an action that's genuinely premeditated, consciously chosen, and then you act upon it. I would argue that our entire legal system, definitely our criminal legal system, depends on this notion of free will and freely chosen actions. Not in all cases, but at least in some cases, the first degree kind of cases. But we hold people morally responsible. You could plausibly say that, well, if we're not in control of our own actions, are we justified at all in holding anyone morally responsible for anything? Every time someone does something that's seemingly morally blameworthy, not even morally reprehensible, but morally blameworthy, maybe. Couldn't you just say, well, those actions weren't freely chosen. They were determined by all the factors that we just talked about, psychological conditioning or social factors, or at the fundamental level, our bodies are just pieces of matter bumping around in the universe according to physical laws. So why do we hold people accountable? Why do we praise them and blame them for their actions morally? Why do we have such a robust notion of ethics if it's possible that all of our actions are determined by all of these factors that are outside of our control? So I guess my point is just that we have good external reasons that are not directly related to the concept of free will, but there are other reasons that are part of our worldview is to hold people responsible for things, to view ourselves as agents in the world, able to guide our own actions, able to have some sort of self-determination, able to have some sort of free will and autonomy. Definitely in America, we have this sense, right? If any country in the world has a sense of self-determination, it's America, right? The ability to control your own destiny and decide what kind of life you want to have. That's part of our American ideals. So we have sort of worldview reasons for holding on to this idea. I think of it in terms of, if you remember when we were talking about Wittgenstein and language games, and when we were talking about the coherence theory of truth, we have this complex web of beliefs, things we believe about the natural world, things we believe about other people, things we believe about science, things we believe about metaphysics and God, things we believe about ourselves. I would argue that a core belief we have as humans is our own autonomy, our own free will, our own ability to choose our own actions. So we lose a lot of our worldview if we abandon the notion of free will. So for me, the starting point is we want to hold on to this notion of free will. We have all these reasons for thinking that maybe we don't have as much free will as we think we have. So how do we preserve this notion of free will? What responses can we give to these forms of determinism to preserve some rich notion of free will while it's under threat from all of these supposedly determining factors? One that I find interesting, I don't know if you guys will find interesting. I don't have a strong background in this. I did have a brief stint as a physics major in college, and I've always found the natural sciences, physics included, and fundamental physics interesting, trying to understand what the universe is made of at a very fundamental level. And I find it fascinating how different the micro level, subatomic physics and quantum mechanics is from everything we see in the macroscopic world. So one way of preserving free will, and this was very popular in the mid-20th century with the rise of quantum mechanics, is what's known as quantum indeterminacy. The idea that at a very fundamental level, the positions of subatomic particles, like the position of an electron orbiting a nucleus of an atom, is not deterministic, that it's inherently probabilistic. 75% of the time you might find the electron over here, and 25% of the time you might find the electron over here. And that you can't, in fact, there's this, principle in quantum mechanics, which you may or may not know, called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's the notion that you can't precisely know both the position and the momentum of a subatomic particle with 100% accuracy. To the extent that you measure a particle's position accurately, you lose your ability to measure its momentum accurately, and vice versa. So if it turns out at a really fundamental level that the physical world doesn't actually operate like Newton thought it did, if it turns out it's non-deterministic, that it operates in terms of probabilities and tendencies rather than mathematical determinacy, then maybe that's a way to carve out some room for free will. I have a little bit of a hard time with this personally. I don't see why probability is any better than determinism from the perspective of free will, right? If it turns out that an electron, goes this direction 75% of the time, goes the other direction 25% of the time, and it's random in some sense, it's like rolling the dice. It's like, a pull of a slot machine lever. It's like you're drawing a random card out of a deck of cards. If there's some randomness in the way the universe unfolds at this quantum level, why does that give me autonomy? Why does that give me control over my actions? In other words, why is randomness any better than determinacy from the perspective of free will? But it's trying to address this fundamental question. The problem with Laplace's demon and this deterministic Newtonian way of thinking about causation as it relates to free will is that if it turns out that there's no openness in the way the universe unfolds, if the universe is necessitated to unfold in one direction and one direction only, in other words, if there's only one physical path forward that the universe can take, if there's no possibility of branches, no genuine options. So, for example, if I keep using these simple examples because I think these are super easy to understand. They make the point. If I decide to go to Panera versus to go to Starbucks, and that's a decision that I make. If the universe is deterministic, it might look like I'm making a free decision. But the idea is that really, because of the laws of nature, really there's only one path that the universe could take. And it might feel like there's another option. If I decide to go to Panera, but I might feel like, yeah, I really could go to Starbucks. I could make a different decision and do something else. That's something of an illusion, right? The universe can only unfold in the way that it actually unfolds. And we might have this sense that there are other possibilities. We can imagine them perhaps, but maybe they aren't real possibilities, even though we think of them as possibilities. But if quantum mechanics actually holds that the universe is non-deterministic, if it really could unfold one way and really could unfold a different way, and that's built into the fabric of the universe, that there are genuine options for the way the physical universe can unfold in the future, then that's opening up a little bit of wiggle room for there to be genuine possibilities in what we as humans actually do. And I think you have to deal with this at the level of physics, right? Because if it turns out that the physical universe is deterministic, so much for free will. Anything that looks like a freely chosen decision is just an illusion. But if it turns out that the universe is non-deterministic, that there are genuine options for the way the universe could unfold in the future, now you've got this intellectual problem. How do you tie this notion of free will to that openness in the physical world at a fundamental level? So what's the link between free will and quantum indeterminacy if it turns out that at a fundamental physical level, the universe is non-deterministic? There are some objections and some concerns about this that we'll look at here in a minute, but let me tap dance through these different options, then we'll dive in and start evaluating them. Another option that we looked at last time is emergence and top-down causation. If it turns out that our consciousness is a higher level emergent property, and if our interactions at that higher level, with other human beings and other minds, with all of these social and cultural factors that make up our lives as humans, if it's possible for those factors to exert some sort of top-down causal influence on the components that make up myself as a biological living system with a mind, then it sure looks like there's some sort of causal role for my mind to play in what my body actually does. If you remember last time, we used the simple example of a snowflake forming as it falls, right? In some sense, the structure of the snowflake, the way the snowflake actually gets formed. In other words, what the snowflake actually does as it unfolds through time, as it falls, is determined in some sense by its interaction at this environmental level, right? The environment is exerting some sort of causal influence on the components that make up the snowflake. So by analogy now, if my mind is an emergent higher level structure or entity or event or property, it depends, different philosophers will define the mind in different ways. But if it's something emergent, in other words, if there's this higher level environmental level of description, social, cultural, political, psychological, all of the things we think of as the human sciences, if those are genuinely emergent and autonomous, and my interactions at those levels, in some sense, dictate what my body actually does, right? In other words, if those factors exert a causal influence on my body and the way my physical body interacts with the physical world around it, then that sure looks like my mind is exerting some sort of top-down causal influence on what my body actually does. So again, a lot of this really does hinge on the notion of bottom-up causation. Are the things in our mind and the actions that our bodies do, are they determined by whatever's going on at the level of fundamental physics in a bottom-up sense? Or do our consciousness and our minds and our experiences and interactions at this human level, at the level of all of these emergent factors that we've talked about, if those factors can exert some sort of causal influence on the components that make up our bodies, that might be another way for preserving this notion of free will. But of course, we run into the problems of causal exclusion that we looked at when we talked about determinism, when we talked about mental causation last week. So it sounds really attractive, like, oh, our minds can be emergent properties, and those emergent properties and interactions at a social, cultural level can determine what my body does. In some sense, my mind is determining the way my body unfolds and what my body actually does. Sounds like a really promising approach if you're open at all to the notion of emergent properties that we looked at last time. Excuse me. But the problem, of course, is that it sure looks like while that's going on, fundamental physics and physical causation at the lower level is just as deterministic, unless quantum mechanics ends up being correct. So it doesn't look like there's any room for the mind or those emergent properties to actually cause anything that's not already being caused at the level of fundamental physics. But it's a very promising approach. Systems biology is all about this. It's all the rage in biology in the last 20 years or so, trying to understand and evaluate and analyze the behavior of organisms based on their environmental factors, not based on not in a bottom-up sense like medicine and all of 20th century anatomy and physics we're trying to do. Like the 20th century explanations were very reductionistic, but systems biology takes explanation in another level. It basically treats organisms, as unified wholes that interact with their environments, and trying to understand what's going on inside an organism by its interaction at this higher level of description, by treating it as an organized whole rather than as a collection of parts. So a very interesting, promising approach, but you're going to run into the problems of causal exclusion, and you have the sort of underlying specter of deterministic physics underlying all of it. A very common way in the discussion of free will in the history of philosophy is this phrase here, and I think this is linguistic sleight of hand to me: the ability to have done otherwise. So if you have the ability to do otherwise, so if you do something, but you have the ability to do something else, then arguably you can say you have free will, right? Because you could have done something else. Now, to me, this is a really kind of vague, cryptic, imprecise phrase that really needs some philosophical analysis. What does it mean to have the ability to do otherwise? Does it mean it's a genuine possibility at the level of fundamental physics? Does it mean that your mind is in control and you could have caused something else to happen? Does it mean you're not constrained and no one's holding you back from doing it? So what does this phrase mean? But I think you get the intuitive idea, which is just that if you have a freely chosen action, if you go to Panera versus Starbucks, that's only a free action if you have the ability to do the other thing, right? course, the hard question is, what exactly does that mean as as it relates to the natural world and physics and the causal role that our minds play? It's very complicated, of course, but the intuitive idea is that if an action is free, you have to have the ability to have done something else. So I've got this cheesy graphic here. There have to be genuine possibilities. And of course, you can read this a couple different ways, right? If no one's holding you back, like, forcing you to go to Panera instead of going to Starbucks, you could say, well, yeah, of course you could have gone to Starbucks because no one's constraining you. No one's got you don't have a gun to your head, right? There are genuine possibilities, but you could also read this from a physics standpoint. The universe has to be built in such a way that there are genuine possibilities in the way the universe could unfold, right? It has to be openness in paths that the future could take. The future has to be more like a tree of potential branches that could actually become actuality. And if the universe doesn't work that way, then there's no room for free will. So you could read this at a macroscopic level, like you don't have a gun to your head, no one's holding you back, you could have made the other decision. But you can also read this at the micro level, like at the most fundamental level of physics. There has to be openness to the field of possibilities that could unfold. And that is a question for physics. I guess I think what's unfortunate is sometimes philosophy can happen in the abstract. Like philosophers will talk about free will and determinism without really interacting with what physicists have to say about this. And my view on this is just that this really does overlap and dovetail with physics, right? If physicists tell us at the end of the day that there is no openness in the way that the universe unfolds, I think that just precludes the possibility of free will altogether. If it turns out that there's some sort of openness, like quantum mechanics, in the way the universe could unfold, now we've got a philosophical problem related to science, right? How do we tie this notion of free will to that physical openness in the natural world, the physical universe that we live in? And that's not obvious at all. So even if it turns out there's some openness in terms of the possibilities for the way the future unfolds, it's not clear at all why that results in free will. And I think there's still some philosophical work to do there. But I think you get the intuitive idea. If an action is freely chosen, you have to have the ability to do otherwise. A very common way of thinking in terms of free will is to think of it in terms of a lack of constraint. In other words, if you're not constrained, if you're not chained to something, if you don't have a gun to your head, if no one's holding you back, if you're not in a jail cell, then your actions are, for all intents and purposes, free. They're not constrained. So again, what's hard here is we have multiple senses of free will, right? We have free will in the sense of our minds causing our bodies to do something. So we have to talk about what mental causation means. We have free will in the sense of openness in the physical world, different ways in which the physical world could unfold at the level of physics. And now we have this notion of freedom as a lack of constraint, not being in prison, not being chained, not having a gun to your head, no one forcing you to do something. To me, the interesting question is, are all of these deterministic factors, things like physical laws of nature, things like biological instincts, things like psychological conditioning and social and cultural deterministic factors, are all of those a type of constraint, like being in jail, like being chained to something, like having a gun to your head, or like being forcibly restrained, your actions being forced a certain direction? If that's an analogy that holds, then all of these factors are a kind of constraint, and they really aren't two different things. And I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes this is viewed as a different kind of freedom, right? The freedom in the sense of a lack of constraint is a little different than freedom in the sense of your mind causing something to happen in the physical world. But if all of these determining factors are just a type of constraint, then really that's the one kind of freedom in question. So it's an interesting question itself, whether this is a different kind of freedom altogether. And of course, which is the salient one? Which one do we care the most about when I say I've made a freely chosen decision, when I go to Panera versus Starbucks, when I choose my college major, when I decide, what relationship to be in, when I decide what career path to take, when I decide how much money to put in my retirement accounts, all of the different decisions that you make that look like they're freely chosen decision, which sense of free will do we care the most about? And I think you can see a few different options here. So that's, some of the interesting ways of talking about free will. Let's dive in and talk about some of the details. So what about this quantum indeterminacy approach? I think this was very promising in the 20th century because up until quantum mechanics, up until it looked like, um, up until then, it looked like Newtonian physics was going to win out, right? Newtonian physics seemed to say that we can predict the motions of things in the physical world, whether they're projectiles, like how far a bullet's going to go before it hits the ground, how the planets orbit the sun, the trajectory of spaceships, uh, rockets, billiard balls on the table. Look at how fruitful that mathematical way of describing the motions of bodies in the physical world was, from Newton and Galileo and Copernicus right up until quantum mechanics. For hundreds of years, this looked like a very promising approach to explaining the behavior of objects in the physical world, again, including our bodies as, excuse me, as part of the physical world. But with the rise of quantum mechanics in the 20th century, it looked like there were some cracks in this way of thinking about the natural world. It sure looked like, at a very fundamental level, the level of subatomic particles, that the behavior of those subatomic particles was not as deterministic as Newton thought they would have been, as scientists predicted them to be before we really had access to what was happening at the subatomic level. So now we've got a couple of options, right? On the one hand, you could say that at a very fundamental level, the universe is non-deterministic, and maybe that carves out some room for free will. I think a really important question, if you're interested in this at all, has to be, if it turns out that the universe is non-deterministic at the most fundamental level, does that indeterminacy manifest itself on a macroscopic scale? So for example, if you have a projectile, like a cannon shoots a cannonball, some number of yards away, at a fundamental level, right, that cannonball is made of matter, which is made of atoms, which is made of subatomic particles. And inside that ball, there's a lot of indeterminacy going on. Where the electrons are inside that cannonball might be non-deterministic. But does the fact that there's indeterminacy inside the matter that makes up that cannonball mean that there's genuine openness in terms of where the cannonball will land? In other words, does that indeterminacy, that openness in terms of where the behavior of matter at that fundamental level, does that mean there's openness at the macroscopic level, at the level of the cannonball and where the cannonball is going to land? Could it turn out that the cannonball will land 25% of the time in one place and 75% of the time in another place, because of this quantum indeterminacy? Some scientists have said, yes, there's a very, 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 very minute chance that spontaneously all of the atoms, all the subatomic particles inside that cannonball will end up 25% of the time somewhere else, and the cannonball will land in the surprising place. That's a really counterintuitive notion. It doesn't square at all with what Newton had to say with the way that the physical world operated. It doesn't square at all with our day-to-day behavior and the predictability that we see in the natural world around us, right? All of physics, all of astrophysics, every time we measure the behavior of something in the physical world and make a prediction about what's going to happen, we're relying on this mathematical predictability. So I think you could plausibly say that, yeah, at the microscopic level, maybe matter and the behavior of matter and the way that the future unfolds is non-deterministic at a fundamental level. But that doesn't necessarily manifest itself at the macroscopic level. So it really could be that there's some quantum indeterminacy going on inside my brain, and there's some quantum indeterminacy going on inside my body. The electrons inside my brain or inside my body, the behavior of the subatomic particles that are inside me might be non-deterministic. But that doesn't necessarily automatically mean that there's indeterminacy at the macroscopic level, at the level of what my body actually does in the natural world, just like the cannonball. So that's, I think, the core of the question. If you want to go this direction and try to use quantum openness or quantum indeterminacy to account for free will, you then, I think, have to give some story. A physicist would have to give some story and make it seem plausible that this microscopic indeterminacy manifests on a macroscopic level. And there's interesting thought experiments like Schrodinger's cat, which is an interesting thought experiment about this, about how quantum indeterminacy can manifest itself on a macroscopic level. Arguably, the behavior of all of our electronic devices hinge on the behavior of transistors and silicon devices, which depend on certain quantum effects. So these quantum interactions do seem to cause certain things in the macroscopic world. Our computers and our iPhones wouldn't function without the kinds of junctions that you get in diodes and transistors depend on quantum effects. If you know anything at all about electronics and the way transistors and diodes work, then those depend in some sense on quantum interaction. So that might be a case of quantum indeterminacy manifesting itself at the macroscopic level. But again, why does that mean there's free will? I don't think that's obvious at all. I should say that there are multiple interpretations of quantum mechanics. The standard interpretation, what became known as the Copenhagen interpretation, is that this indeterminacy that we see at the microscopic level is fundamental. That there's no what's called hidden variables behind the scenes. That it's not that we just don't understand the causal factors that are dictating the behavior of those subatomic particles. It's that the behavior of those subatomic particles is genuinely probabilistic, genuinely non-deterministic. But an immediate criticism could be, well, it really could just be deterministic. If you keep kind of zeroing down to to an even more fundamental level of physics, maybe there's something that's determining, why the electron goes this way 25% of the time and why you can find the electron over here 75% of the time. That there's some sort of deterministic causal factor, a hidden variable that we don't understand yet that really is making it deterministic, but it just looks like it's non-deterministic because we don't understand what that causal factor is. Maybe we can't for some practical reason, maybe we can't zero down and zoom in any further than we're able to, because of things like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And so maybe it really is deterministic and we just don't understand why it's deterministic. We can't see what's actually doing the determining. That's called the hidden variable interpretation of quantum mechanics versus the Copenhagen interpretation, which is that the universe is genuinely open. So again, it's a promising idea, and you can see why with the rise of quantum mechanics in the 20th century and 20th century physics, why this would be so exciting in philosophy, right? If it turns out that the physical universe is not deterministic, that there's genuine openness to the way it unfolds, maybe that's how we can save this notion of free will. But it's not obvious at all, right? Even if it turns out that the physical universe is non-deterministic, again, I don't see why that's any better from the perspective of free will, right? If it's like rolling a dice. If I roll a die and go, okay, it landed on 6 this time, then it landed on 5 the next time, then it lands on 3 the next time. It's truly random. Like, the electron's over here 25% of the time, and it's 75% over here 75% of the time, and it's random. It's like a roll of the dice. Why does that mean I have free will, right? What I want out of the notion of free will, I want my actions to be under my control, right? I want my mind to be determining what my body actually does. So in some sense, you could say that free will actually depends on determinism, right? If your mind is a causal factor that dictates what your body does, that itself is a kind of determinism. Randomness is not going to do that, right? Randomness doesn't give you control. Randomness takes control away, makes it even less deterministic. So I'm not too optimistic that quantum mechanics is going to be the end-all be-all of free will. But this was a very promising, exciting notion with the rise of quantum mechanics in the 20th century. Last time we talked about top-down causation. Again, I think this is really, really probably the most promising approach on this screen here. If our mind and all of our mental properties are emergent, if they're genuinely novel, emergent properties that are not reducible to lower level physical properties, not reducible to my anatomy, not reducible to what's going on inside my brain, then it looks like there's some room for my mind to cause something in this sense of top-down causation. But top-down causation itself is kind of an illusion, right? Yes, when a snowflake falls, it's interacting with its environment. The snowflake is forming in a unique way. But I wouldn't say that the snowflake has free will, right? The snowflake is still being determined by external factors outside of its control. So yeah, if my mind is something emergent, and I'm interacting with my environment, I'm interacting with the world around me, I'm interacting with other minds, like right now, if my mind is an emergent property and your minds are emergent properties, and we're interacting, right, at this emergent mental level that's unique to human beings. Um, why does that give me any more control over my destiny than if my body were determined by lower level physical factors? It's not obvious at all that that means that my behaviors are not deterministic. Just like the snowflake falling, you can't explain it internally, right? You can't explain the formation of a snowflake as it falls just based on the material and the matter inside that snowflake. You have to invoke its environment. But really, all the interactions are just deterministic interactions, right? The pressure and the humidity and the temperature and all the things that affect the formation of the snowflake. Yes, they're not under the snowflake's control, but they're deterministic as much as any deterministic interaction is. So I'm not sure why this means that we have free will anymore. So it's an exciting notion, this idea that our minds exert some sort of top-down causation on our bodies. But again, if it turns out that those are just deterministic top-down causal factors, if my interactions with my environment, my interactions with other people, and your interactions with your environment, your interactions with other people are all just as deterministic, and those exert some sort of top-down causal influence on your body, why then does that mean we have free will? Seems like that would be just as deterministic as bottom-up causation. So it's exciting. I think it squares a lot with this move away from reductionistic explanations that we're seeing in the last 20 or 30 years. But I think it's not obvious at all that that results in the kind of openness and autonomy that we want out of free will. Of course, the ability to have done otherwise, what exactly does that mean? That's not clear at all. It could mean that, we're not constrained. It could mean that there's genuine openness in the physical world. But again, why does that result in free will? I don't think that's clear at all. So there's some inherent ambiguity in what free will actually means. And there are these promising strategies to try to preserve this notion of free will. But I think you can see that there's problems with all of them. And they all seem to conflict with the notion that we can explain things at a physical level rather than at the level of mental causation. The problem, what we called the problem of causal exclusion last time. Let's move on. There's this hybrid view called compatibilism, and I think the name is very obvious here. It makes it intuitively clear what it means. Compatibilism is just the view that free will and determinism don't contradict each other, that there's no incompatibility, that because an action is free doesn't mean it's not determined, and if an action is determined, it can still be a freely chosen action, even if it's determined. So let's look at what that might mean. Let me skip ahead here, actually. So I want you to think about this example. It's a fun example, simple, like a lot of. I think what I find fascinating about philosophy in general, and especially these kind of simplistic thought experiments, is that they get right to the heart of the issue in a way that anyone can understand. This is not a technical problem, right? These aren't technical examples. Anyone can imagine these situations. So have fun with these examples. What if you were tied to a chair, constrained? You had ropes around you tied to this chair. And of course, I like Eames chair, so I put an Eames chair there. Tied to a chair that you actually want to sit in. So you're constrained. You can't do anything else. So if you remember when we were talking about free will, one concept of free will is that an action is determined if you can't do otherwise. And if you're tied to a chair, if someone I'm sitting in a chair right now. If one of you guys was malicious and wrapped a bunch of ropes around me and tied me to the chair, arguably I can't do anything else, right? You have constrained me, restricted my free will. But what if I really want to sit on the chair and I don't struggle and I don't resist and I don't oppose being restricted to the chair? In other words, if I really just kind of passively sit here and enjoy being in the chair while there are ropes around me, while you're tying me to the chair. Now, I guess what the fundamental question here is yes, it sure looks like it's determinism, right? You can't do anything else. But is it also a freely chosen action? Can you freely decide to sit in a chair that you're constrained to? So you can't do anything else. If you decided to do something else, you couldn't because you're constrained, but you're freely choosing because you're not resisting the constraints. And so it's a free action nonetheless. I'm curious what you guys think about this example. So, if you want to take yourself off mute and respond, one or two of you, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this. Is this a case of genuine free will, even though it's a determined action?
I think it would be better to sit in the chair you want to sit in instead of be forced to sit in the chair you want to sit in, because
Well, yeah, we can modify the
part of
example.
the
Like, suppose I'm sitting in the chair happily.
Right.
And while I'm sitting in the chair happily, someone wraps a bunch of ropes around me, and I'm sitting. I'm now tied to the chair, even though I was sitting in the chair happily from the beginning.
Right. I what I'm trying to say is part of the reason I would want to sit in a chair is because that would be my free will. But being tied to that chair would be different. I think that kind of takes away wanting to sit in that chair.
No, it's like there's an expression: a prisoner who loves their chains, right?
Right.
A prisoner who is content,
Oh,
inside that jail cell,
right.
inside that
I
prison
see what you
cell,
mean.
right? That prisoner isn't choosing to do anything different. They're freely choosing to sit where they're at, right? Content, loving their chains.
Right.
Is that genuine freedom? There's something dissatisfying about it. It's not freedom in the sense of like, hey, you can do anything.
Yeah.
You don't have self-determination, but at the level of an individual decision, I'm deciding to sit in the chair. I'm deciding to sit inside the room. Um, it's not like autonomy. It's not like, oh, I can now decide to do whatever I want with my life. But in the moment, is that single decision a free action?
I think there's multiple levels to it. I think it's um your mind, it is free will because that's your you're not struggling if you're happy with where you are. But at the same time, it's also not free will because even if you didn't want to, you can't get up. Like if you change your mind, you would still be stuck there.
Yeah, but
So,
I think the key is, I guess, this is an analogy, right? This could be an analogy for every decision we make. So
right.
let me go back to the Starbucks versus Panera decision. Do I get my coffee from Starbucks or do I get my coffee from Panera? I like Panera's reward system. Okay, so I go to Panera. Turns out that maybe the laws of nature conspire against me, and the laws of nature, at the fundamental level of physics, all work together to produce my body going to Panera. That's one type of constraint, right? If it turns
Right.
out that's how the natural world works, that's like being tied to a chair. You can't do anything else. If it turns out that I have this psychological conditioning, like maybe I've got an addiction to a certain kind of, certain kind of coffee or a certain kind of food product at Panera, right? And I'm
Right.
conditioned to choose that because of, this addictive effect that I get when I consume that kind of thing, like the rat and the cheese, arguably, right? Um, if it turns out there's social and and cultural pressure to choose one over the other, maybe one's more environmentally friendly than the other, I have no idea. um, if it turns out that I get a little dopamine hit in my brain every time I get a Panera reward, and that's why I go to Panera, right? The kinds of things that neuroscientists would tell us about, right? The dopamine effect when something feels good. And all of those collectively conspire against me and force me to go to Panera, right? But I love it. I'm sitting here going, which do I want to go to? Do I go to Panera or do I go to Starbucks? Turns out I really want to go to Panera, right? Now I'm seemingly freely choosing to go to Panera. I want to go to Panera. That much is incontrovertible, right? Instead of Starbucks. So now you've got an interesting question. It's definitely determined for any number of different reasons you could point to at any level of science, right? From social sciences to biological sciences to psychological sciences to physics. All of those have a reason for a story to tell about why I'm going to Panera, right? But if I really want to go to Panera and I'm freely choosing, that's what my will is. That's what I want, in other words. Then is this analogous to like wanting to be tied to a chair? I can't do anything else. Turns out there's only one thing I could do: go to Panera for all these different reasons. But does the fact that I want to go to Panera also make it a freely chosen action, even though there's nothing else I could have done? In other words, are free will and determinism compatible? It's not obvious at all. I feel like there's something deeply dissatisfying about this notion of free will. I'm curious what your guys' intuition is. Like, this was the dominant view in the 20th century. This was like the main way of reconciling free will and determinism, just to say there's no problem with free will and determinism. We can freely choose all kinds of things. We can decide what we want. That's what it means to have a will, is to have a desire for something or to choose something or to want something, right? And so it doesn't matter if there's openness in the universe or if there's only one way that things can unfold. It doesn't matter if those deterministic factors that we talked about are constraints. What matters is that even if there's only one thing that we could do, are we actually wanting that thing? And if so, then it's, yes, the action is determined, but the action is also free because that's what our will wants. And this was the dominant way, just to kind of hand wave and say, well, okay, there's no problem. Even though an action's determined maybe doesn't mean that the action's not also freely chosen. Doesn't mean we don't actually will or want that thing. Like the name implies, free will. Like my mind can will whatever it wants, and if I will the thing that I'm determined to do, then yeah, it's a freely willed action, even though it's determined. So let me move on. Another way of reconciling free will and determinism is to think of the mind as a determining cause. And I'm going to back up to this diagram we had here with the problem of causal exclusion, because I think this will help make it clear. So if P2 here is an action that our body does, my going to Panera, for example, if it turns out that the mind is the determining factor, in other words, if this downward arrow holds, then it seems like we've got a case of free will and determinism, right? On the one hand, it's free because my mind is causing the physical event to happen. On the other hand, it's determined because the mental decision is necessitating or making it absolutely have to be the case that that's what my body does. In other words, if my mind is the determining factor, is the determining cause, then it sure looks like, you have a case of free will and determinism, right? Free will insofar as the mind is causing your body to do something, and determinism insofar as this arrow is a deterministic arrow, your mind determining what your body does. In the mathematical sense, like given this mental state, it necessitates that your body does something at the level of sufficient explanation. If that's the case, then it sure looks like you have free will and determinism. But I think this is a huge problem. I think it sounds promising. You can go, well, obviously, this is what it means to make a decision, right? If I decide to get a cup of coffee and then my body gets a cup of coffee, obviously there's some sort of causal arrow between my decision and what my body actually does. It seems like that's kind of the definition of free will. My mind caused me to do something, but it's also the definition of determinism. Some prior state, my decision, determined my body to do something, and that's as much a case of determinism as anything else. So free will and determinism. I guess for me, I keep running against this problem of causal exclusion, though. It sure looks like you can explain the existence of that mental state by the existence of some prior physical brain state, or simultaneous brain state if a brain state simultaneously instantiates the mental state. I think that's how most people think of supervenience, that the mental state is instantiated not later in time, but at the exact same time. So given a certain mental state, you have given a certain brain state, you get a certain mental state that's instantiated simultaneously. But it doesn't make sense to talk about a mental state, mental property that exists on its own, unless you're a dualist. If you're Descartes and a dualist, you might think this makes perfect sense, like a free-floating mind causing your body to do something. But if you're not a dualist, the mind is tied to the brain in some way. So it doesn't make sense to talk about kind of a causal chain like this from P1 to M1, from M1 to P2, because you can always draw this horizontal arrow between brain states. And when we're talking about physical causal closure, in other words, causal explanations in the physical universe, it doesn't look like you ever need to invoke anything mental. So this problem of causal exclusion seems to just undercut the possibility that the mind can be a completely sufficient determining causal factor for physical events that our bodies do, because you can always tell a neurological story, and that mental state is always grounded in some physical brain state. So it sounds promising to say that, well, the mind just is the sufficient physical cause of what our body does. But a neuroscientist or a biologist is going to say, nope, wait a minute. You can always tell a physical story about why your body does that thing, or why you've made that decision, what's going on inside your brain, or what's going on with your anatomy that leads to that kind of that action that your body does. You never seem to need to invoke the mental to explain why your body does what it does. So you run against this problem of causal exclusion every time you try to go that direction. So at the end of the day, what does this mean for free will and determinism? I I think you can see the problem, right? There's no shortage of determining factors, physical factors, biological factors, social and cultural factors, psychological factors that threaten to undercut this notion of free will, the idea that our actions are freely chosen. Even actions that look like they're freely chosen may not be freely chosen. There's a deep problem in physics. Is the natural world open to the existence of possibilities or not open to the existence of possibilities? And even if it is open to the existence of alternative possibilities, it's not obvious at all why that means we have free will, why that means we have genuine control over the way the universe actually unfolds. If it's just randomness, that doesn't seem any better. There are different notions of free will, right? This sense of mental causation. There's free will in the sense of not being constrained. It's an interesting question whether all of these constraining, determining factors are like constraints, whether they're like being tied to a chair. It's also an interesting question whether these two concepts are incompatible in the first place, right? Can you say, even if your actions are determined, even if there's only one thing you could have done, even if you're constrained or guided or steered towards choosing certain actions based on all of these constraining factors, could it just be that, yeah, you can want those, you can will those, so you have free will, even though there's nothing else you could do or could have done? But for me, again, I had these thoughts 20 years ago, and after thinking about it for 20 years, I still have the same basic concern about all of these approaches to reconciling free will and determinism. That any attempt to reconcile free will with determinism in the ways we talked about relies on a really weak notion of free will. If free will means choosing to love your chains, like choosing to love the ropes around you, while you're tied to the chair, even though you can't do anything else, that's a pretty weak notion of free will. If it means that your actions are not genuinely caused by your mind, caused by your decisions, caused by your intentions, caused by your desires, then it's not clear at all why we would call that free will, right? What I want out of free will is some sort of self-determination, right? I want to be able to genuinely control the path of my life, either in the short term or in the long term. I want to be able to look at the future and think of it in terms of an open field of possibilities, and which possibility I actually instantiate is under my control, as a result of my mind, my consciousness, my intentionality, my mental states, right? My decisions, my autonomy. And if I can't say something really rich and robust like that, like a compatibilist just says, oh, there's only one thing you could do, and even if you want that, there's still only one thing you can do. To me, that is such an incredibly weak notion of free will. It doesn't give you the kind of autonomy and self-determination and self-control that we want out of free will. The whole reason we care about free will is to give us some sort of autonomy over our own lives. Yes, to hold other people responsible for things, but I think the main factor, as I think about it, is this sense of self-determination over your own life. So I think there have to be at least two things that are true with free will. The universe has to be genuinely open. There has to be some sort of indeterminacy in the physical world. Yes, but that's not enough. That's not sufficient, because randomness, if it turns out that yes, there's 10 different paths that the future could take, and which one gets instantiated is like a roll of a die. That's not a very robust sense of free will either. That doesn't give you the kind of control or autonomy that you want out of free will. So for me, the only way to reconcile this is to have two things. Yes, indeterminacy in the natural world. The universe has to be genuinely open to alternative possibilities in the future, non-deterministic. But there also has to be some sort of way to reconcile this notion of mental causation with it, right? Your mind has to play some sort of causal role in what your body actually does. And if you can't save that notion of mental causation without reducing it away to whatever's going on inside your brain or within your body at a physical level, in other words, if the problem of causal exclusion is really intractable and there's no way to solve it, in other words, if there's no room, extra, no causal influence that your mind has that isn't already accounted for by physical causation inside your mind or inside your brain or inside your body, then again, why would we call that free will, right? If it turns out that every decision you make, even if the universe is open, is just caused neurologically by what's going on inside your brain, if it's just caused anatomically by what's going on inside your body, then that doesn't seem like it's a very robust notion of free will either. But the problem is that every time you try to say, aha, my mind as some sort of emergent property, instantiated by my brain, is playing a causal role, you then immediately have to tell some sort of physical story or philosophical story about how you reconcile that causal role of the mind with the other kinds of causes that are going on. The causation that's happening at a physical level inside your brain, the causation that's happening around you with the physical world, the causation that's happening at a physical level inside your body. All of those things seem to exclude the possibility that there's anything kind of left over for your mind to do that isn't already explainable at a physical level. And I think this is the hard problem for me of free will, but it's deeply tied to the problem of mental causation and philosophy of mind. And again, this is as much for my benefit as for yours, but for you, I just want you to have an overview of these different views. Here are the different ways of thinking about determinism. Here are the different ways of thinking about free will. Here are the different attempts to try to reconcile them. And here are some of the objections to those views. But I think it's actually a shame that philosophy of mind and philosophers who think about free will and determinism don't talk to each other more, and talk to scientists, honestly, because you can see the overlap with physics here, right? There's no way to talk about free will and determinism without talking to physicists and figuring out what the physicists have to tell us about the way the physical universe actually works, right? Just having the discussion of free will and determinism without that physics background, which itself is an open question, right? Physicists themselves disagree about this. So it's not like we can just say, oh, the physicists say that the universe is open, or the physicists tell us that the universe is causally closed, or the physicists are saying the universe is deterministic, or the quantum mechanicists are saying that the physical universe is not causally closed, that it's open to genuine possibilities. Because even in physics, this is an open question. So again, it's not a purely philosophical question. It's as much a question for the natural sciences as anything. Interesting questions about top-down causation, the nature of causation itself here. Is causation always bottom-up, or is there some substantive sense of top-down causation that's not explainable by bottom-up causation? But if there's not some way to preserve this notion of mental causation, some causal role for our minds to play, I think at the end of the day, you'd be forced to say that free will is merely an illusion. But it's not enough just to say, well, obviously our minds cause things. Like every time I make a decision, my body does something. The question itself is that a genuine case of mental causation? Is our mind actually causing our bodies to do something? Or are our minds, last time we introduced the term epiphenomenalism, or are our minds epiphenomenal? Do they kind of float up here above our bodies, tied to our brains, yes, as an emergent property, but themselves not actually causing anything to happen? All the causation happening down here at the physical level, at the level of neuroscience, or at the level of anatomy, or even at the level of environmentalism, right? My body's interaction with the environment is a type of physical causation. If my mind is an emergent property arising out of my brain, but itself not actually causing anything, it might seem like I'm making decisions. But if every time you make a decision, you can go, oh yeah, it might look like you're making a decision, but really that's just a matter of what's going on inside your brain. Your brain's operations have determined what you're going to do. Then again, that's a pretty weak notion of free will, and I don't find that satisfying at all, because maybe this is just a selfish standpoint, but I want some autonomy over my life. And so do you. And you decide what path you want to take in life, what you're going to major in, what relationship to be in, what career to have, all the choices, big and small, that you're going to make in the course of your lives. If it turns out that those aren't actually under your control, if there's no causal arrow that goes from your mind to your body, your mind dictating what your body actually does, and if it turns out that the physical universe isn't open to different possibilities, then free will at best is an illusion. It might look like free will, but really you're just determined to do what you're going to do, and any sense of free will is an illusion. And I find that remarkably dissatisfying. So compatibilism, for me, from the very first time I encountered it, I had this kind of negative reaction to it. Like, if that's what they mean by free will, that's not enough, right? It doesn't give me the sense of autonomy that I look for. That doesn't give me any substantive reason to hold people accountable for things, to praise them for certain kinds of praiseworthy behaviors and blame them for certain kinds of negative behaviors. It doesn't give me any kind of control over or self-determination. It doesn't give me control over my own destiny. So that's not what I mean by free will. They might mean that that sense of free will. And so in some sense, in this weak sense of just deciding what you want, that's one sense of free will. And I guess this is the question: what does free will actually mean? Does free will mean what you want, what you desire? And if that's all it means, then sure, it can be compatible, right? You can desire, sitting in a chair that you're tied to. You can love the jail cell that you're in. You can love the path that you're on, even though it's determined by all these factors that are outside your control. Or there's this richer, more robust notion of free will, that our minds are the causal factors that dictate what our body actually does. And what our body actually does, either in the short term or in the long term, in the path of your entire life, is somehow caused by your mind. So to me, free will depends on interaction between mind and body, with the mind being the causal factor. But the problem, and you can see this in our discussion of philosophy of mind over the last few class sessions, no matter what view you have of philosophy of mind, you run into a problem with this. If you're a dualist like Descartes, a substance dualist, you struggle to explain why a non-physical mind can interact causally with a physical body or a physical brain, with completely different sets of properties. If you're a property dualist, there's only one kind of substance, and there's physical properties and mental properties. Same problem, right? How do non-physical mental properties causally interact with physical properties, especially when the laws of nature seem to hold all on their own? If you're an emergence theorist, you run into the problem of causal exclusion, where it sure seems like causation at the most fundamental physical level seems perfectly adequate. So you don't ever need to invoke a higher level emergent mental property to explain what our bodies do neuroscientifically, or in terms of our anatomy, or in terms of our body's interaction with the external world. Of course, if you're an identity theorist, there is no mind even to cause something, right? Just is brain state. So the problem doesn't even exist if you're an identity theorist. So no matter what philosophy of mind you have, you immediately run into the problem of interaction. How does the mind interact with the physical world? It's often described in terms of mind body, but really we're talking about the mind and the brain, right? How does the mind exert some sort of causal influence on the brain, which has a causal influence on your body, producing whatever actions you actually choose? And if there's no coherent way to tell that story, if any way you tell it is just a kind of illusion, either it's contradictory or it doesn't make sense, like for substance dualism, or you get stuck in this knot of the problem of causal exclusion. No matter which story you tell, you can't preserve this notion of mental causation. It seems to force you in the direction of determinism. And some philosophers just bite the bullet and go, oh, well, so much for free will, right? What do you actually lose? I'm still going to make decisions. I'm still going to go to Starbucks. I'm still going to decide to major in something. I'm still going to make choices and live the rest of my life. It doesn't have any real practical consequence. I'm still going to make all those decisions, even if they're just pseudo decisions and illusory decisions. I'm still going to do all those things. So who cares? But for me, I feel like we lose something deeply. Like we lose our sense of autonomy. If all of our autonomy and our self-determination and our sense of free will is an illusion, I feel like we lose a lot of ourselves when we go that direction, when we go the direction of determinism. Even if it turns out to be true, I feel like we should mourn its loss. Shouldn't be an easy thing to lose philosophically. Should change the way we relate to each other, relate to ourselves. If it really, think about this, if it really does turn out that every time someone makes a decision, for good or bad, they make a good decision, they make a bad decision, that it's literally not under their control. They couldn't have done otherwise. Physicists are saying, this is the way the physical universe works. Biologists are saying it's instinct, and psychologists are saying it's all conditioning, and it's all a matter of social and cultural factors. If all of that holds, then why would we praise people for doing well? Why would we blame people when they fail? Would we stop holding people morally and ethically responsible for things? You could say maybe we'd be kinder, more compassionate people if every time we looked at someone who did something we didn't like as, oh, it's not really their fault, right? Because of all these factors. maybe we'd end up with a kinder, more compassionate world. That would be a direction to go as well. But I think it should have some change in the way we relate to ourselves and relate to other people if it turns out that determinism is true and we don't actually have free will. But we have good reasons for trying to hold on to this notion of free will if we can. But for me, this easy move towards compatibilism is not going to do it. You have to have some sort of substantive, robust story about mental causation from philosophy of mind and how the natural and physical world works. And for me, I veer towards emergence and non-reductive physicalism as the way that's going to get us there. Systems biology is moving that direction. Arguably, neuroscience is moving that direction. Philosophy has moved that direction. I feel like this is a very promising approach to trying to preserve some notion of free will through concepts like top-down causation and emergent properties. But it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to tell a coherent story that really does reconcile with everything physicists tell us, everything biologists tell us, everything neuroscientists tell us, everything we understand about ourselves philosophically. Putting all of that together into a coherent whole in a consistent story that evades all of the problems we've talked about has been remarkably difficult. So anyways, that's all I have for you guys today. Feel free to ask me any questions if you have any questions now, either about the requirements for the class. Remember that your final papers are due a week from today. Again, with no leeway, because I have to have time to grade your papers and calculate and submit the final grade. So make sure you get your final papers submitted. Definitely let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you guys on Tuesday for our last class session before our final class. There was a question about this earlier before we started class. We will actually have a final class session, a virtual class session. I've got kind of a fun, what I think of as an exciting, different kind of philosophy class for our last class session. I encourage you to be here if you can for our last class session, even though for all intents and purposes, the class will be done at that point. I have something planned. I think it'll be fun and exciting and interesting. I hope you can make it to our last class session. If there's nothing else, I'll see you guys next Tuesday.
Yeah, have a good day.
Thanks. Have a
Bye.
great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.